Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this week's recorded version of class. In lieu of our normal synchronous meetings, I'm just recording this for you to listen to and think about while I'm away at a conference. I decided to use a funky background for this class just because I'm the only one here, and somehow it just seemed like it'd be fun to do that. Anyways, it's very weird talking to myself without having anyone listening, but we'll see how this goes. So just give me a second to set up my my screen here. Hoping that this is working, especially because I'm only going to find out if it worked until after I've done the whole thing, because that's when I'll have a chance to actually see what happened. But anyways, here we go. So what we're doing today is switching gears to a new topic, which is called contextualism, or contextualism about knowledge. As it happens, the way we're going to segue into this new topic is by connecting it to where we left off, which was the problem of radical skepticism, or external world skepticism more specifically. Because as we'll see, contextualism, one of the kind of interesting features of it, or kind of motivating ideas behind it, is that it may provide us with a really nifty solution of external world skepticism. But it's a much more general idea than that, as we'll see by continuing along here. So a key development in contemporary epistemology has been exactly this shift in the focus, and shift in what we're interested in, to the language that we use when we talk about epistemic matters. So, you know, so far in the term, we've been talking about epistemic concepts like knowledge, justified belief, and so on. We haven't explicitly been talking about those words like knowledge and justified belief. This linguistic turn in epistemology does just that. It turns its attention to the words themselves, the meanings of these words. And part of the reason for this has just been an increased suspicion that some of the central problems of epistemology arise because we failed to be clear on how this language works exactly. Maybe it's not as simple as the word knows means knowledge. Maybe it's more complicated than that. And maybe some problems that we've been dealing with are actually the result of not thinking about this clearly. So what contextualists think is that getting clear on the semantics of knows can actually help respond to a bunch of philosophical problems. Radical skepticism, or external world skepticism, included. So consider other context-sensitive words like the indexical I, or words like she, now, here, next week. Those are all context-sensitive words. What do I mean by that? I mean, the very meaning of these words depends on their context of utterance, right? In these cases, it depends on who specifically is uttering them and when they're being uttered, right? So when you say, I am here now, those words have a very different meaning than they do when I say those words, right? They refer to completely different people when different people use them. Or when I say I'm in the gym now, that sentence has a very different meaning depending on whether I utter it at 5 o'clock p.m. or at 5 o'clock a.m. Contextualism argues that knows behaves in a very similar way to those words. More specifically, contextualism says that knows varies in its sense across contexts of speech in such a way that S knows that P, that sentence, can have one meaning in one context of use and another in another context. So an upshot of this idea is that the very same sentence can be true in certain contexts and false in others. For example, in some contexts, the word knows might mean something stronger in a way that we'll spell out as we go along. In others, it might mean something weaker. And the thought is, this might be, in turn, what's causing a bunch of really interesting and big problems in epistemology. It might, not seeing this might be actually what's causing us to deal with problems that are literally unsolvable, understood as such. So the contextualist thinks we should be thinking seriously about whether this is what's going on, whether this thesis about the word knows is true. A bit more specifically, when it comes to the problem of external world skepticism, here's what the contextualist has to say. Cartesian skepticism might be basically working by the skeptic putting us in a context in which the word knows means something particularly strong, even though it doesn't mean that in all contexts. So the contextualist basic diagnosis of skepticism then is that it's a perfectly good argument, right? The argument that we've been engaging with, it's a perfectly good argument as such, but we make a mistake when we overgeneralize it. Okay. All the argument establishes, according to the contextualist, is that the sentence, "I don't know I have hands," is true in what we might call high standards contexts. It doesn't establish that that sentence is always true. In fact, it might very well be false, and the converse, "I know that I have hands," be true in certain low standards contexts, or in other words, in contexts in which knows means something weaker. Okay, so let's think about this in a little bit more detail by comparing a kind of analogous idea, right? So consider the following argument. All tabletops have some bumps on them. If something has some bumps on it, then it isn't flat. Therefore, no tabletops are flat. That's a silly argument, right? I mean, I'm guessing that you don't sort of sit there and hear that argument thinking, you know, that's pretty persuasive. Like, no tabletops are flat. I agree. What's wrong with the argument? Well, in a sense, it's just uninteresting is what the problem is. It's a perfectly valid argument. The thing is, premises one and two, they're only true on a very strong sense of flat. So the most that follows is that 3 is true in a very strong sense of flat. It doesn't follow that no tabletops are flat is true in a weaker sense of flat, like in the ordinary everyday usage of the word flat. So that's what I mean when I say maybe the argument's perfectly valid, it's just the conclusion isn't very interesting, because all it's establishing is that no tabletops are flat is true in a very strong sense of the word flat, a sense that we don't normally use unless we're doing like, I don't know, some kind of hardcore like physics or something, right? Where we need like absolute flatness to be our standard. Well, according to contextualism, the same goes for knows. To go along with the skeptic's premises, you just get sucked into thinking about knows in a very strong sense. But all that follows is that you don't know you have hands is true in a very strong sense of knows. It doesn't follow that I know I have hands is never true in any context. For example, in some contexts where a weaker sense of knows is at play. You know, like when you're in the grocery store and you say, yeah, I know where the pickles are. It doesn't follow that what you say is false in that sentence, because you're speaking in a different context where the word knows actually has a slightly different sense. So the idea is to think about contexts, you know, like these circles, right? When we're talking about external world skepticism, it's a context where the word knows has a very strong sense. But there are other contexts, the contextualist thinks, like when we're talking about what we know in grocery stores doing the shopping. The mistake, according to contextualism, in the skeptical problem isn't that the argument's invalid. It is a perfectly valid argument, but just like the tabletops example, all it does is it shows that we don't know that we have hands in a very strong sense of knows. We make a mistake if we overgeneralize from that conclusion and think, well, then in no contexts at all do we ever utter the words, I know that such and such truly. Like when we're in a grocery store, we say we know, well, imagine for some odd reason you say you know you have hands in a grocery store. Or, when you say you know where the pickles are. What this is called then is actually a diagnosis of skepticism, not a direct response. Right, a direct response to the problem of external world skepticism would show that somehow the argument is invalid or that one of the premises isn't true. A diagnosis is something different. It doesn't actually argue that there's anything specifically speaking wrong with the argument, namely that it's invalid or one of the premises is untrue. What it does rather is it just says we shouldn't get carried away with the argument. We shouldn't take the argument to be saying more than it really is. So contextualism doesn't say that your knowledge itself somehow depends or changes depending on your situation or who's talking about you. Holding a context fixed, what you need to know or what you know depends entirely on normal things we'd say knowledge depends on, namely evidence, justification, and truth. Contextualism doesn't say that knows is actually technically lexically ambiguous, like the word bank or the word safe. It has a core meaning, something that determines how each use of it will vary across context, but that's why we say its sense varies a little bit. So that's just more of a mechanical issue that you don't really need to worry about. The basic point about contextualism being a diagnosis is just that it's not a direct response to skepticism. It's a claim about how the word knows works as a linguistic entity. And it just says the conclusion of the skeptical problem just isn't very interesting because it just says we don't know we've got hands in a very strong sense of the word knows. Just like the tabletops example. So what this means is we need to get clear on some things about how this idea really works exactly. Because, it seems like it'd be a pretty neat way of resolving our puzzlement about the skeptical problem, for example, and maybe it can do other things too. One important question is what exactly determines context? Right, we're saying knows has a slightly different sense in different contexts. What determines contexts? What determines whether you're in one context rather than another? Well, there's a few different ways that epistemologists have tried kind of spelling this idea out in more detail. The textbook talks about two different ways in particular, which I'll just go through briefly. So the first way is what's known as the relevant alternatives implementation. As it happens, kind of a bit of a background point, something we didn't talk about when we were talking about the definition of knowledge is one account of the meaning of the word knows, or like what knowledge is what's known as the relevant alternatives account. Basically, very roughly, what the relevant alternatives theory says that what it means to know that P is just that you can rule out all the relevant alternatives to P, right? So I know that I'm holding a water bottle. Whoa, that's weird. Kind of gets screwed up because of the background. You guys don't know that I'm holding a water bottle, but I do. Because I can rule out that I'm not holding like a wine bottle or a cup, or what the theory says, relevant alternatives to the possibility that I'm holding a water bottle. I don't need to rule out that I'm not dreaming right now in order to know that I'm holding a water bottle, according to this theory, because that's just not a relevant alternative. Now, you might actually use this theory of knowledge to actually respond to skepticism just like that and say, well, look, we know we're not brains and vats because or we know we've got hands because the possibility of being brains and vats just isn't a relevant alternative. The problem with going that route is it just leaves totally unexplained why the skeptical argument seems so convincing in the first place. Like when we look at the argument, it really does seem like a puzzle that it's not at all obvious how to solve. This theory is just assuming kind of that it's obvious how to make the puzzle go away, but in a way that leaves our sort of initial perplexity totally unexplained. The contextualist could take this idea and use it slightly differently so that we get the result that we can know we have hands, but also kind of account for why the skeptical argument seems compelling. And the idea is just to use relevant alternatives as a mechanism for determining context. Okay. So the idea is contexts are determined by what alternatives are relevant in that context. Okay, so there's an example in the textbook of, I think it's a guy and his wife talking about where their car is, right? So normally, if you can rule out that your car is not in lot A or B, when you say to your wife, I know it's in lot C, then what you say counts as knowledge, as long as your car really is in lot C, okay? But if someone says, well, maybe it's been stolen, there's been lots of thefts in lot C since we left, that may make the stolen car hypothesis relevant. All of a sudden, the question of whether your car is stolen is now a relevant alternative to your claim that your car is in lot C. And because you can't rule that out just by, reflecting on the fact that your car's, not in A or B, you'd have to go out and check whether the car's still there to rule out that it wasn't stolen. All of a sudden, in this context, you may not know that your car is in C. So that's just to say, the context is partly constituted by which alternatives to your claim, the truth of your claim, are relevant or at issue. And when certain alternatives are at issue because of the context, that means you have to be able to rule them out if you're going to count as knowing things. Knowing those specific things, like where your car is, for example. So the basic idea with skepticism is the skeptic makes the BIV scenario a relevant alternative. And since you can't rule it out, right, your evidence doesn't rule it out. It doesn't rule out, I know that I'm not a BIV is false in this context. So too is I know I have hands, not ruled out by your evidence, because your evidence doesn't rule out the relevant alternative. I'm a handless BIV being tricked into think I have hands. That's the relevant alternative here. Your evidence, namely that it looks to you just like you've got hands, doesn't rule that alternative out. So in this context, you don't know that you have hands. The idea can explain why we were puzzled by the argument just by saying we didn't realize that knows functions as a context-sensitive word. So that's how we just explain why this kind of problem was gripping in the first place, even though it's not really a problem. It's an interesting question to consider how exactly an alternative becomes relevant. On some accounts, an alternative becomes relevant just by entering the conversational context. It's an interesting question whether that kind of should be enough to make one context change into another. Like if it's really fair for just because someone cooks up some crazy error possibility, that's enough to have an effect on what you count as knowing. But we can talk about that when we meet again synchronously if you guys have questions about that. A different, so here's just like a visual representation of the relevant alternatives implementation, right? So the idea is just, one context is different from another because of the alternatives that are relevant in it, right? So here, when you say, that the pickles are in aisle 8 in the skeptical context, the relevant alternative is, but how do you know you're not a BIV and the grocery store doesn't even exist? That's what you would have to be able to rule out in order to count as knowing in this context. Namely, in some kind of ordinary context, like when you're in a grocery store shopping with your friend, if you say, I know that the pickles are in aisle 8, all you need to do to count as knowing is be able to rule out that, they're not in aisle 7, for example. You might say something like, well, I was here yesterday and I saw them in 8. that might be sufficient evidence to rule out that they're not in 7, and so you count as knowing. A different way of spelling out the idea of a context, or sort of what differentiates one context from another, is what's known as the standards implementation. It just says that an attribution of S knows that P is true in a context of speech C if and only if S's belief in P satisfies the epistemic standards determined by the context. So the basic idea is just that in different contexts, the strength of justification or evidence that you need differs. The strength that you need in order to count as knowing something differs in the context. Okay, so in the airport case, for example, we're not saying that what makes that context different when someone raises the error possibility of your car being stolen is that, you know, this alternative, sorry, the relevant alternatives have changed. What we're saying is that the strength of justification that you need, or strength of evidence, the amount of evidence you need, has gone up in that context to count as knowing something. So, you know, to give this a visual representation, we could say, think of this little symbol here as like your evidence meter, right? In the skeptical context, the amount of evidence you need on the evidence meter to count as knowing that you have hands is really high. You need like a really high standard of evidence to count as knowing. Meanwhile, in the grocery store context, you know, the amount of evidence you need, or the standard of evidence or justification that you need in order to count as knowing something, is a lot lower. You don't need nearly as high of a standard to meet nearly as high of a standard of evidence to count as knowing the relevant proposition. So that's just a different way of thinking about what makes something a context, right? Or what differentiates one context rather than another. Maybe it's just all about the sort of standards that we have to meet, whether they're high or low, so to speak. A really important sort of issue for contextualism, something that has kind of been debated a lot and that contextualists have an important job of showing, is that this really is a well-motivated view about the semantics of the word knows. For example, you know, if the only reason we had to go along with this theory is that it makes the skeptical problem seem less threatening, then that wouldn't really be a good reason to adopt this view about the semantics of the word know. You know, after all, to put it one way, it seems like then we would just be giving an ad hoc defense of contextualism, right? Oftentimes, if you have a philosophical theory, and the only reason you can give for believing the theory is that it makes a problem go away, and there's no independent reasons to think the theory is true, then we say that your theory is ad hoc, or at least you're giving an ad hoc argument for the theory. I mean, moreover, like, think about it like this. None of you guys seem to notice that the word knows is context sensitive before we learned about the theory, right? Otherwise, this solution would have just jumped out at you, wouldn't it? I mean, compare, you know, if I introduced you to that no tabletops are flat argument earlier, and, you know, even if I didn't explicitly point out to you what was going on in the argument, don't you think you would have immediately noticed that something was fishy with that argument? Like, imagine I sincerely came up to you guys and presented that argument to you, trying to argue that no tabletops are flat. I don't think that you would have been particularly moved by my argument. You would have probably immediately seen that the argument just trades on the context sensitivity of the word flat. Sometimes we use the word flat in a very demanding way, and other times we use it in a much less demanding way. All my argument establishes is that no tabletops are flat in the super demanding sense of flat. None of you, that idea didn't jump out to any of you. At least none of you raised it in class as a possible way of dealing with the skeptical problem. Maybe you thought of it and didn't mention it. If so, you know, that's you know, good job. But I think when a lot of people teach this topic to students, it's not something that immediately jumps out at them. And so this raises the question, what reason do we have to believe that this theory of the semantics of the word knows is true? We better have more reason to think that it's true than just the fact that it makes the problem of radical skepticism go away. And so this does get us into terrain that extends much more broadly than the problem of skepticism. And we'll pick up on that very shortly. I'll just say a couple other things before getting to those more general issues about kind of what we might think about this as a solution to the problem of skepticism. Sorry, that's from what I was just saying. I mean, one question to ask the contextualist here is whether the skeptic really does raise the standards for knowledge. I mean, that's a crucial claim that's being made by the contextualist, that the skeptic raises the standards needed to count as knowing something. But do they really do that? I mean, one thing to think about there is sort of exactly in line with what I was just saying. Like, none of you guys seem to notice that there was anything fishy with the way I was using the word knows in presenting the argument. I was even arguing that, like, part of why this seems like a puzzling argument is all of these premises just seem super plausible on a very ordinary conception of what knowledge requires. So does premise one, the premise that, you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, does that invoke a particularly high standards use of the word knowledge, or do you just lack knowledge on an ordinary usage of the word knows that you're not a brain in a vat? Something to think about. I mean, just to kind of tie that back into relevant alternatives, if you think of the idea of a standard for knowledge as being connected to what alternatives are being considered relevant, then you might think, well, being able to rule out that you're not a BIV is kind of like a really stringent level of like alternatives that you're being asked to be able to rule out. So lots to think about there as well, I think. Another issue or something to think about just specifically about this as a solution to skepticism is whether it's really satisfying as a solution to the problem. Right? Assuming that the skeptic does raise the standards that are required for knowledge, doesn't this amount to saying then that by the good standards or the better standards, the more like high quality standards, you don't know you have hands? By the crappy lower standards, you do, though. I mean, does that leave you feeling like you've got what you want out of your epistemological exploration into the problem of skepticism? You know that you've got hands according to the crappy standards? Or do you want more than that? Like, do you want to be able to show you've got hands like in a perfectly good sense of the word knows? Also something interesting to think about. I mean, I think an immediate response there is just because we're differentiating between high so-called standards and low standards, or very stringent and less stringent, doesn't necessarily mean that we mean, high in the sense of like being good or better. We just mean like high in the sense of how much evidence you need or how little evidence you need. And you may think, well, there's no reason to like assume that we're making a normative judgment about like how good our knowledge is in low standards context. We're just talking about the kinds of considerations that we need to rule out, or the kind of evidence that we need to count as knowing in those situations. In any case, what I want to do now is switch completely away from the problem of skepticism and think about some of these broader issues for contextualism, the ones that I mentioned up here in point 1. Because they're really interesting in their own right, and they get us into basically a new subject, which is just the question of whether contextualism is true, full stop, but also how it relates to another really important idea in epistemology known as pragmatic encroachment. So that's what I'm going to do next. And the way that we do this is we talk about these things called the stakes shifting cases. So these stakes shifting cases are laid out on page 113 if you're wanting to find them. I'm going to read the cases directly from the book in a sec. But the basic kind of issue here is the following. Is there any reason to think contextualism is true aside from its diagnosis of skepticism? Well, the contextualist, as it happens, thinks that there is. And the most common consideration that they offer is to appeal to pairs of cases in which what's at stake changes dramatically. And then pointing out contextualism's ability to explain our intuitions about knowledge attributions in those cases. Okay, so that's going to be the basic idea. What's a stake? Well, think of a stake as just the cost of being wrong. Okay, it's a practical factor that's at play in a scenario where we're deciding whether we want to attribute knowledge to someone. Okay, so it's kind of like the costs of having a false belief. That's a stake, right? What sorts of things will happen if you're wrong about a particular matter? I mean, think about it like this. What's at stake of you guys, knowing whether contextualism is true or not? I'm not really sure, actually, but you might think there's a huge amount at stake about whether you have a true belief as to whether your degree is going to help you get a job. Let's say it turned out that BU is like a totally bogus institution that no employer will ever, give you credit for having a degree from. That's obviously not the case. But if you were wrong in thinking that this degree is going to help you get a job, there'd be a lot at stake there. You would have wasted 3 or 4 years of your life and potentially be unemployed. So let's hope that you've got a true belief about this. Let's hope that you know that you're going to, your prospects of getting a job are at least a little bit higher by having a degree from BU. Okay, so that's the idea of a stake. And again, the basic idea that contextualists use to try to argue that contextualism is true is they appeal to pairs of cases in which what's at stake is radically different, and they try to explain the intuitions about how we feel inclined to attribute knowledge across those cases. Because what we're going to see when we look at a couple of these cases is that our inclination to attribute knowledge changes depending on what's at stake. They're really interesting cases, actually. So they're called the bank cases, or sometimes they're called the bank cases. And actually, I just realized that I need to close out of the PowerPoint so I can read the cases. So again, it's the important thing to think about here is that these are pairs of cases, right? So I'm going to read the first one, which is called bank case A, and then I'm going to read the second one, which is called bank case B. So case A, my wife and I are driving home on a Friday afternoon. We plan to stop at the bank on the way home to deposit our paychecks. But as we drive past the bank, we notice that the lines inside are very long, as they often are on Friday afternoons. Although we generally like to deposit our paychecks as soon as possible, it's not especially important in this case that they be deposited right away. So I suggest that we drive straight home, deposit our paychecks on Saturday morning. My wife says, maybe the bank won't be open tomorrow. Lots of banks are closed on Saturdays. I reply, no, I know it'll be open. I was there just 2 weeks ago on Saturday. It's open until noon. Okay, so that's case A. Case B is the same as case A. However, in this case, me and my wife have just written a very large and important check. If our paychecks are not deposited into our checking account before Monday, the important check we wrote will bounce, leaving us in a very bad situation. And of course, the bank isn't open on Sunday. My wife reminds me of these facts. She then says, banks do change their hours. Do you know the bank will be open tomorrow? Remaining as confident as I was before that the bank will be open, I still nevertheless reply, well, no, I guess we'd better go and make sure. Okay, so that's case B, right? It's the same in all respects as case A, except the stakes are way higher about being wrong about whether the bank is open on Saturday. In particular, this check's going to bounce if the bank's not open on Saturday, and they may lose their mortgage. And what the case as described suggests is, in that situation, the husband feels less inclined to say that he knows that the bank will be open on Saturday. Whereas in the first case, he felt perfectly happy to say he knows that the bank is open on Saturday, because in that case, not very much hangs on whether he's right, actually. So the idea behind the cases is we should, or what the contextualist thinks, is that you're going to have intuitions that broadly track what this husband feels comfortable about saying. You're going to have intuitions such that when he says he knows the bank's open on Saturday in the first case, he's speaking more or less truly. But also in the second case, when he says he doesn't know that the bank's going to be open on Saturday, there it seems like he's speaking truly as well. It kind of does seem like they should go and check before he says fairly that he knows the bank's open, because so much is at stake. So what we can do with these cases is derive an argument for contextualism. The argument goes like this. In bank case A, the sentence, "I know it'll be open," seems true. In bank case B, the sentence, "Well, no, I guess I don't know it'll be open," also seems true. Premise 3, your epistemic position is exactly the same across cases A and B. What does that mean? It just means you have the exact same amount of evidence or justification for thinking the bank is open in case A and case B. In both cases, your evidence is just that you were there last Saturday or maybe 2 weeks ago, and you saw that the bank was open. That's your evidence. That hasn't changed across cases. But if your epistemic position is the same, then if no had the same sense in both contexts, you couldn't speak truly in both cases. If your epistemic position is the same, then if the word knows had the same sense in both contexts, you couldn't speak truly in both cases. So it seems like the word knows must have a different sense in the two contexts. That is to say, contextualism must be true. So the basic idea, if you really are speaking truly in these two sentences, but you're asserting completely different things, right? In one case, you're saying you do know it'll be open. In the other, you're saying you don't. If knows had the exact same sense in both of those contexts, you couldn't be speaking truly. You can't both know and not know in exactly the same sense. It doesn't, that's kind of an absurdity, right? So the idea is, because your epistemic position is the same, the only thing that could be changing here is the sense of the word knows. Specifically, what you mean when you say, "I know it'll be open." What you mean when you say, "I don't know it'll be open." The thought, according to contextualism, is in case A, you're speaking truly in a lower standard sense of knows. Whereas in case B, you're speaking truly in a higher standard sense of knows. So that's the argument. That's independent reason for thinking that contextualism is true. Reason that has nothing to do with its ability to resolve the skeptical problem. So when we're asking, do we have independent motivation for thinking that this is a correct theory about the semantics of the word knows? Here's one potential source of motivation. The stakes shifting cases. It seems like our intuitions about whether we're willing to attribute knowledge to someone change in situations where the stakes change, but the epistemic position of the person does not. It seems like the only way to explain what's going on there is to say, well, we must be meaning different things when we say the word knows in each case. That's the idea. What might we say in response to this argument? Well, I'll get to that in a sec. First, let me just explain a little bit about what the argument has going for it. Just quickly, I mean, concerning premises 1 and 2, people certainly talk like this all the time, right? in ways that fluctuate with stakes. Like this is just kind of, it seems like an interesting observation to make about the word knows and the way that we feel willing to use it in everyday life, right? Like when the stakes go up, it just seems true that we feel slightly less okay with saying that we know stuff. Now that doesn't entail that we are speaking truly when we talk like the guy in the cases, but it's evidence that we are. Okay. So premises 1 and 2 kind of seem very plausible, actually, just by reflecting on everyday life. Premise 3 is just supposed to be guaranteed by the way the cases are described, right? The way that we're articulating these cases, they just do, you're supposed to acknowledge that they're cases in which the person's epistemic position has not changed, right? The guy's evidence is the same. Premise 4 is plausible insofar as the idea of whether someone knows something is very plausibly a matter of what epistemic position they're in, how much evidence they have, how reliable their belief-forming process is, etc. The contrasting idea would be knowledge itself might depend on stakes in some interesting sense, and we'll get to that shortly. And this, as it happens to be where most of the action in this debate is. This is where the debate between contextualism and what's known as pragmatic encroachment enters the picture, but we'll get to that in a sec. Let's think about ways we might respond to this argument. But first, why would we want to respond to this argument exactly? Like, why not just take contextualism on board? What's the big deal? Well, a couple of things here. First, claiming that a central word in our language is context sensitive is a robust theoretical claim. It has to fit with our best current linguistics, for example, which is a real empirical science. And that's a serious sticking point for contextualists. Whether it really fits with linguistics and actual empirical science isn't actually entirely obvious. There's an interesting book by a guy named Jason Stanley, written in 2005 called Knowledge and Practical Interests, where he argues that contextualism does not fit with the linguistic data. But that's a huge kind of live debate in epistemology. But what I'm saying right now is that's why we shouldn't just be totally sanguine in accepting the stakes shifting cases, sort of like show that contextualism is true. Another thing is contextualism seems to require positing what's sometimes called a sort of weird form of semantic blindness. That is to say, to make a point that I've already made, actually, none of us noticed this fact about the word knows until I introduced contextualism to you. At least none of us pointed it out in class, right? None of you immediately said, that's what's going wrong with Cartesian skepticism. Knows is context sensitive. So what this seems to imply is that if knows really is context sensitive, we're semantically blind to that fact. As ordinary speakers, it's not something we're immediately aware of, in a way that we're immediately aware of the fact that the word tall is context sensitive, or the word flat, or all those indexicals I used earlier, like here, now, this week. We, as ordinary English speakers, we know that those words are context sensitive. That's why the tabletops argument seemed immediately sort of silly. Or, when I say my 8-year-old kid's tall, that I'm not saying like that he would compete well in a NBA basketball match, because I mean tall for an 8-year-old kid. So we're immediately aware that these words are used in certain ways in different contexts. It doesn't seem like we're aware of that when it comes to the word knows. And so this is just, again, another reason why we need to take this seriously, whether we're willing to accept the argument from stakes shifting, or whether we're generally willing to accept contextualism as a theory, as cool as it kind of seems like it is. So if we wanted to be sticks in the mud, so to speak, and resist contextualism, as a bunch of epistemologists have done, here's a couple of things that we could say in response to the argument. These are sort of interesting things to think about in their own right anyways, actually. So one thing we could do is actually reject premise 1. I said premise 1 and 2 both seem pretty plausible because of just reflections on the way people tend to speak in everyday life. But maybe, strictly speaking, when the husband says he knows the bank will be open in bank case A, he's not speaking truly, like literally. Sometimes the truth of an assertion and its appropriateness come apart in interesting ways. Sometimes whether an assertion is literally true and whether it's appropriate to make come apart in interesting ways, right? Sometimes it's appropriate to assert something that's strictly speaking false. And sometimes it's not appropriate to assert the literal truth. Okay, so in premise 1, maybe it's not true, literally speaking, that the bank's open, that you know the bank's open, right? Maybe you're just close enough to knowing that it's appropriate for you to say so. Like, when someone says, the game's over, I'm leaving, when it's 5-0 with only 1 minute to go in the third period, right? That sentence, the game's over, isn't strictly speaking true. There's still a minute to go, but it's appropriate to say, or it can be appropriate to say, the game's over when you're in a situation where it's 5-0 and there's only 1 minute to go, right? So that might be what we sometimes call an appropriate use of loose use, an appropriate instance of loose use. Maybe when the husband says he knows the bank will be open, he's just kind of speaking loosely. It's like an appropriate instance of loose use, an appropriate loose use of the word knows. One problem with taking this approach to the argument, sort of saying, for whatever reason, like premise 1 is false, you just want to resist the idea that the husband knows the bank's open on Saturday, is that you're kind of just opening the door to skepticism, right? Are we ever speaking truly when we say we know stuff? I mean, bank case 1 seems like a perfectly good candidate for someone truly saying they know something. So, if we end up trying to resist this argument by denying that the husband knows that the bank's open on Saturday, we may end up having to deny that we ever speak truly when we know things, when we say we know things at all. And if you take what I've been saying over and over again in this class to heart, namely that it seems like the 8th most used word in the English language, the idea that we're just always speaking falsely when we use it is just a really kind of strange bullet to bite, actually. So not many philosophers go the route of rejecting premise 1, but some have tried rejecting premise 2, kind of going in the opposite direction and suggesting that when the husband says he doesn't know that the bank will be open, he's actually speaking falsely. This is not a true sentence. Maybe the person in bank case B does know that the bank will be open on Saturday, but perhaps it would just somehow be misleading for them to actually explicitly assert this. Maybe something about the situation makes him saying, I know it'll be open tomorrow, misleading, even though strictly speaking, he does know it's open tomorrow. I mean, compare the following scenario. Imagine a woman has dinner with her father, who happens to be a handsome man. Let's say that this woman's partner doesn't know anything about her father. And the next day he asks, what did you do last night? It seems unlikely that this woman's going to say, oh, I had dinner with a handsome man. Right? I mean, I guess the basic idea here is like, why would you say something that's potentially going to make your partner jealous, for example? But it's strictly speaking true. She did have dinner with a handsome man. So there's a case where even though it's strictly speaking true that the husband, that this woman had dinner with a handsome man, she wouldn't flat out assert this, right? It would somehow kind of be inappropriate in the sense that maybe not very prudent for her. Like she doesn't want to get into some kind of unnecessary quibble with her partner about whether she's having an affair, for example. Okay, well, in the bank case then, why would I know the bank will be open on Saturday be a misleading or inappropriate thing for the husband to say? Well, one explanation is it would seem to imply that the husband and wife can actually act on that belief, right? They can just rest content knowing it'll be open on Saturday and kind of go home and chill out on Friday, right? They can act on it. It would certainly seem to imply that. I've been saying this repeatedly as well in class, that one of the interesting things about the word knows is it kind of just seems to certify action. Maybe implying that in this particular case, because there's so much at stake, implying that they can act on this belief is somehow misleading, because maybe it's just too risky to act on the belief that it'll be open tomorrow. Maybe in certain very risky situations, we need more than knowledge in order to act. Maybe sometimes if so much is at stake, like losing your mortgage, for example, you actually need like certainty in a belief in order to act on it. In this case, in order for the husband and wife to rest content that they can go chill out on a Friday and wait till Saturday to go cash their check. So that would be a way of explaining kind of how outright asserting that I know the bank will be open on Saturday, even though it might strictly speaking be true, because after all, he's in the exact same epistemic position as in case A, it would somehow be misleading for him to say it, because it would imply that they could act on it, and then that's why it would be inappropriate. And so premise one is actually, we can reject it, because strictly speaking, when he says he doesn't know, and he flat out asserts that, he's speaking falsely. Right. And the key idea behind both of these maneuvers, rejecting P1 or P2, is to say there's no data that we need contextualism to explain, right? If one of those sentences is false, then it seems like we have no need to make, endorse a contextualist view about the semantics of knows, because there's no puzzle in how we could be speaking, truly making two completely different assertions in the same epistemic position. Right? There's no inconsistency after all. One problem with arguing this way about premise two is the following. Not only does it seem okay not to say one knows in case B, right? It does seem okay for the husband to say, to refrain from saying he knows that the bank will be open. It also seems perfectly fine for him to assert that he does not know that the bank will be open tomorrow. But return to the handsome father example. It seems fine for the woman to refrain from saying, I had dinner with a handsome man. Like that does sort of seem just prudent, right? But it seems much less fine for her to say, I did not have dinner with a handsome man, right? When her partner says, what'd you do last night? It would actually, because she literally did have dinner with a handsome man, it would be kind of weird for her to say, I did not have dinner with a handsome man. I mean, she would just be uttering a falsehood. And maybe for that reason, it seems inappropriate. But this last sort of claim is licensed in the bank case, right? It seems fine for the guy to say that he does not know that that the bank will be open on Saturday. So the case actually seems importantly different. Namely, when something is strictly speaking true, it can be appropriate sometimes not to say it, but never appropriate, perhaps, to actually deny it. I'll put a question mark behind that, right? In many cases, it will seem inappropriate to actually deny something that's strictly speaking true. But that's exactly what it seems we're forced to say about the bank case if we want to reject P2. So those are just two examples of replies to the stakes shifting cases that focus on ways that true and appropriate assertions can come apart. Other responses to the case look elsewhere. In particular, some philosophers have focused on premise 4. One idea here is maybe knowledge doesn't just depend on your strength of epistemic position, things like justification, evidence, and reliability. Maybe it also actually depends itself on pragmatic factors or practical interests. Maybe knowledge actually directly depends on, is kind of partially determined by what's at stake in being wrong. The idea would be one's epistemic position could be the same in two cases, and the sense of the word knows actually be the same, and yet the sentence S knows that P could have two different truth values in those situations because the stakes are different. Even though one's epistemic position is the same, the difference in stakes might directly affect a person's knowledge. So the term knows may not be context sensitive per se. We don't have to develop a theory about the semantics of the word knows. It's just that what the word refers to itself, the entity of knowledge, the thing that we have sometimes and sometimes don't, is partially dependent on the candidate knower's practical interests. That idea is what's known as pragmatic encroachment. Pragmatic encroachment says that practical factors, things like what's at stake for someone and whether they know, encroach on their knowledge. Okay? It's a really interesting idea. What they're saying is whether you know can kind of come and go depending on just how much is at stake for you in being wrong. Where we're going to go next, I'm going to stop talking for today because I think that's enough to kind of try to digest for one session, is we're going to look at this idea about pragmatic encroachment in more detail. My guess is right now you're probably not entirely clear on what the difference between pragmatic encroachment and contextualism is. So I'm going to say a bit more about that. It's actually a pretty tricky distinction to really wrap your head around, but we'll try our best. And then we'll also just think about kind of what can we say in defense of the idea of pragmatic encroachment, in defense of this idea that knowledge is partially dependent on how much is at stake for you in being wrong. One, incidentally, I'll just flag as an interesting thing to think about when it comes to the idea of pragmatic encroachment is Jason Stanley, the guy that I mentioned a while ago, who developed an argument against contextualism, and as it happens, in support of pragmatic encroachment, has also argued that a really interesting upshot of pragmatic encroachment is that it seems like members of marginalized groups in society are at a disadvantage in terms of their knowledge, precisely because there's more at stake for them in everyday life than members of privileged groups. Right. So if you're, a member of a marginalized group that tends to be much less economically well off, for example, there's just more at stake for you in life than a member of a privileged group who's not typically economically badly off. Because if you're economically badly off, things matter. Like whether you can pay your bills at the end of the month, you may be at risk of being evicted. You may be at risk of going hungry. And so there's just generally more at stake for you in being wrong in what you think, because there's more at stake for you just generally in life. And so this may be a really interesting kind of argument for social justice, in the sense that social injustices harm members of marginalized groups on an epistemic level, in addition to so many other levels, obviously. But that's something that maybe we can talk about more when we meet synchronously. Another thing that we're going to be doing to kind of motivate the idea of pragmatic encroachment is shift gears and talk about assertion next time we meet. So have a look at the parts of the textbook that talk about assertion and pragmatic encroachment. So that's all for today. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys very soon.